My dearest friends, gather close. I am going to tell you a story now. A story that has been etched into the very bones of my being. It is not an easy tale to tell, for it winds through the deepest valleys of a mother's heartbreak and climbs to the unexpected peaks of a woman's rediscovered strength. This is the story of my quiet revenge. It was a revenge that was not forged in the white-hot fires of rage, but rather built slowly, stone by patient stone, from the bedrock of profound disappointment, and cemented with a resolve I never knew I carried within me. It began not with a dramatic shout or a slammed door, but with a chilling whisper that echoed in the sanctuary of my own home. A whisper that came from the mouth of my only child. You see, they profoundly underestimated me. My own son, David, and his wife, Lauren, looked at my silver hair, my hands softened by time, and my gentle grandmotherly demeanor, and they made a fatal calculation. They mistook my life's gentleness for frailty, my enduring kindness for a pliable weakness, and my boundless love for them as a door they could simply lock behind themselves when I was no longer convenient. They saw the wrapping of a humble old woman and failed utterly to perceive the formidable library of experience, resilience, and quiet intelligence that lived within. The day of the great betrayal was, of all ordinary days, a Tuesday. I remember this detail with crystalline clarity because of the way the late afternoon sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, painting a perfect, warm golden square on the well-worn oak floor. I was humming an old tune, wiping the flour from my counter after baking the oatmeal cookies David had loved since boyhood, when he walked in. His footsteps were heavier than usual, purposeful. Lauren hovered just behind him in the doorway, her posture tense, like a nervous bird poised for flight. "Mom, we need to talk," David said. His voice carried a false, bright cheer I knew well. The tone one uses with a small child who needs coaxing or a difficult employee who requires careful management. My heart, ever hopeful where he was concerned, fluttered for a moment. I thought perhaps he was going to ask for another batch of those cookies, or maybe tell me about a promotion at work, or seek advice about a vacation plan. I offered my warmest smile, the one that had soothed his childhood scrapes and celebrated his adult triumphs. "We've been thinking a lot about your future, Mom," he began as Lauren nodded vigorously, stepping fully into the room. "We want you to be comfortable. You've given so much to this family, and now it's our turn to make sure you're taken care of." The words, on the surface, were sweet, the kind of sentiment a mother dreams of hearing. But they landed in the room with a strange, metallic chill, like coins dropped on a frozen pond. My smile didn't fade, but it grew still on my face. With the brisk, efficient air of corporate executives presenting a takeover plan, they laid out their vision for my remaining years. This house, the one my late husband Jack and I had built with sweat and dreams, was suddenly, in their telling, a burden. It was too large for one woman, they insisted. The stairs were a looming hazard, the expansive garden too much physical labor, the upkeep a financial drain. They announced with a flourish, found the perfect solution. A lovely modern senior living community called Sunset Meadows. It boasted single-level living, organized social activities, on-site medical staff, and no responsibilities. They slid a glossy brochure across the kitchen table toward me. The faces on it were all smiling, surrounded by blooming flowers and holding hands in common areas. To me, it looked less like a community and more like a beautifully decorated waiting room for the end of life. A comfortable cage with pretty wallpaper. Then came the ultimatum, delivered with a jarring, transactional finality. They needed an answer, they said, in 1 week. 1 week to decide the fate of my home. 1 week to pack a lifetime of memories, of love, of struggle, and of triumph into anonymous cardboard boxes. They framed it as a transition, a next chapter. To my ears, it was an eviction. They were asking me to leave the walls that held the echoes of Jack's laughter, to abandon the garden where we had planted a sapling the day we learned I was pregnant, to walk away from every scar and joy etched into the very grain of the wood. I lifted my eyes from that cruel brochure and looked into my son's face. In that moment, I did not see the little boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose nightmares I had chased away, whose future I had fiercely believed in. I saw a polite, determined stranger, a man motivated by a cold calculus I could not, and did not want to fathom. Was it the soaring market value of this land? Was it the simple, unvarnished inconvenience of an aging mother in the way of his sleek, new life with Lauren? The realization was a physical blow, a seismic crack that traveled from my heart through my entire body, leaving me hollowed out and trembling inside. Yet, from that terrifying hollow, from the crater of that betrayal, something new began to form. It did not rise as a hot, messy geyser of rage or tears, though I would have been entitled to both. Instead, it emerged as a cold, clear, and absolute clarity, sharp as a diamond and just as hard. This was my home. Every shingle, every nail, every spoon in the drawer was paid for with the currency of my life's work and love. I would not be managed. I would not be ushered out with patronizing smiles and brochures for gilded pastures. A profound resolve settled in my soul, heavy and immovable. My revenge, I knew then, would not be loud or violent. It would not involve screaming matches or public scandals. No, my revenge would be as patient and inevitable as the turning of the earth. It would be the quiet, unassailable fact of my continued presence. I would win not by fighting them on their terms, but by refusing to leave the battlefield they had chosen. My weapon would be my will, and my armor would be the very law and truth they assumed I was too old to understand. And so, I did something that clearly surprised them. I let my gentle, grandmotherly smile return, the one they mistook for submission. I reached out and patted David's hand where it rested on the table. "Oh, you two are so thoughtful to worry about me," I said, my voice a soft, grateful murmur. "It's truly kind of you. Let me take this information and look it over properly. It does seem like an awful lot to consider at my age." I saw his shoulders drop in visible, almost comical relief. Lauren let out a small, audible sigh. In their eyes, they saw compliance. They saw the easy victory they had anticipated. They saw a meek old woman capitulating to the logical plans of her wiser, younger caretakers. What they did not see, what they were utterly blind to, was the forging of tempered steel behind my calm, blue eyes. The strategy had begun the moment clarity had banished the shock. That night, after they left with satisfied smiles and promises to call in a few days, I did not collapse. I did not weep into my pillow, though a part of my heart was mourning. Instead, I put the kettle on, selected a robust English breakfast tea, and sat at the very same kitchen table, now bathed in the soft glow of a single lamp. I sipped my tea, and I began to think with a strategic focus I hadn't summoned in decades. The first and most fundamental rule of any quiet revenge, I understood instinctively, is to know precisely what you hold. You must take a silent, unwavering inventory of your power, your assets, and your rights. My mind went to the past, to my dear Jack, a man who was both a romantic and a pragmatist. He had always spoken of protecting his girls, Me and our young son. With that memory as my guide, I rose and walked slowly to his old study, a room that still faintly smelled of his pipe tobacco and leather books. But before we continue, I want to extend a very specially invitation to you: subscribe the channel and leave a like. This helps me see that you support me and enjoy my stories, and comment down below which city you are watching us from right now. Let's continue. Behind a rather unremarkable painting of a sailing ship, a painting David had never liked and therefore never looked at twice, was a small wall-mounted safe. Jack had shown me the combination on our 40th anniversary, placing my fingers on the dial. For emergencies, Ellie, he had said. My hands, which had trembled earlier, were now perfectly steady as I spun the dial. Right to 22, left past 10 to 7, right to 35. There was a solid, satisfying clunk. Inside were no glittering jewels or dramatic stacks of cash. What lay within was far more valuable. A portfolio of documents, the quiet history of our life's work and foresight. I lifted them out with reverence and brought them back to the kitchen light. There was the original faded mortgage paper, marked paid in full, with a satisfying stamp. There was Jack's last will and testament. And then my fingers brushed against two other papers. One was the deed to our property. The other was a promissory note, a loan agreement for $75,000, signed by David a decade ago when he was desperate to launch his tech startup. A loan he had never once mentioned repaying after the initial few payments stalled. I smoothed the deed open first. My eyes, still sharp despite my years, scanned the formal language. And there it was, the foundational truth of my coming defense. John A. Harper and Eleanor G. Harper, as joint tenants with rights of survivorship. Jack had insisted on this specific legal phrasing. It means if anything happens to me, Ellie, the house comes to you clean and clear. No probate, no questions. It's yours. When he passed, that is exactly what had happened. The house was not part of a shared estate. It was mine, solely and completely. David's name was nowhere on this document. He had no legal claim, no ownership interest, not a single whisper of a right to sell it or force me from it. Unless, of course, I could be persuaded or coerced into willingly signing my ownership away. I would have sooner signed my own death certificate. I placed the deed carefully to one side, a cornerstone of my peace. Next, I examined the promissory note. It was all there in David's own impatient scrawl. The amount, the now laughably low interest rate, the repayment schedule he had abandoned. It was not about the money. It was about the principle, the broken promise, the entitled assumption that his parents' resources were a permanent, interest-free extension of his own. I placed it next to the deed. The pieces of my quiet counteroffensive were falling into place. The second rule of quiet revenge is to secure your allies wisely and discreetly. You cannot fight a war, even a cold one, entirely alone, and you must choose champions who are both powerful and trustworthy. I needed a lawyer, but not a friendly local notary. I needed a strategic warrior in a professional suit. Someone who could navigate the cold waters of family law and elder rights with precision and grit. I thought immediately of Susan Carter. I had known Susan since she was a gawky, brilliant 13-year-old who babysat a rambunctious David. She had devoured the books on our shelves and told me she would one day fix things that were broken. Now she was a partner at Carter & Blythe, a family law firm with a reputation for formidable, strategic brilliance, especially in cases of financial exploitation. It was nearly 9 p.m., but I called her private line, the number she had given me years ago, for anything, Anytime, Eleanor. Eleanor. Her voice came, warm but alert, hearing the hour in my call. Is everything all right? I took a steadying breath. Susan, my dear, I'm afraid I need your professional help. It seems my son and daughter-in-law have decided to retire me from my own life. I explained the situation with clinical detachment, reciting the Tuesday ultimatum, the Sunset Meadows brochure, the 1-week deadline. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by a low, furious murmur. Eleanor, this is unfortunately, disgustingly common. Do not sign a single thing. Do not agree to anything verbally that could be construed as consent. Your home is your fortress. You stay right where you are. Her mind was already racing ahead. I am emailing you a confidentiality agreement right now. Sign it digitally and send it back the moment you get it. From that instant, you and I are attorney-client privileged. Everything you tell me is a protected secret. We are going to build a wall around you, and they won't see it until they walk right into it. With Susan as my general, the fog of panic lifted entirely, replaced by a clear campaign map. The third rule is to understand your opponent's weaknesses intimately. David and Lauren's primary weakness was not their greed, though that was present. It was their towering, condescending assumption. They assumed I was legally and financially ignorant. They assumed I was emotionally isolated and would crumble under pressure. They assumed my love for my son would be the lever they could use to move me. They were preparing for an emotional plea. I was preparing a fact-based defense. Their visits took on a new, almost comic character. They came more frequently, armed with freshly printed Sunset Meadows brochures and cheerful anecdotes about community and safety. I played my part perfectly. I would serve them my cookies, nod along, and ask questions so gentle they seemed naive. Oh, is it a buy-in community, or a monthly lease? I inquired one afternoon, my eyes wide. Lauren blinked, momentarily thrown. It's a monthly lease, Mother, she said, recovering. But of course David and I would help. How kind, I murmured. But how much is the monthly lease? I do like to understand the numbers. David shifted in his chair, a tell he'd had since childhood. It's around $4,500, he said, trying to sound offhand. But like Lauren said, we can. My social security is $1,800 a month, I interrupted softly, as if just working it out on my fingers. Where would the other $2,700 come from each month, dear? David and Lauren exchanged a fleeting, panicked look, a crack in their unified front. It was the look of a hasty plan unraveling at a seam they hadn't reinforced. We would cover it, David stated too quickly. For a while. I nodded slowly, as if deeply moved by this dubious generosity. That is so kind of you, David. But I could never be a financial burden on you too. Not with your future, and the children you might have one day. The staggering hypocrisy of his offer, to pay to remove me from an asset they wanted, while likely planning to sell it for their own gain, hung thick in the air, acknowledged by no one but felt by everyone. They thought they were gently managing a frail old woman. In reality, I was calmly, methodically managing them, collecting every piece of data, every complaint about the outdated kitchen, every sigh about the rising property taxes, as intelligence for my defense. The fourth rule is to fortify your position silently. You must make your foundation unshakable before the storm hits. I called a local handyman, Luis, a stout, kind man in his 50s who had fixed my gutter after a storm and refused to overcharge. Luis, I said when he answered. This is Eleanor Harper. I need a security system installed. Not a big, flashy one with signs out front. The quietest, best cameras you can get. I want to see the front door, the back porch, and the full length of the driveway. He came the next day, a time when I knew David and Lauren were at work. He asked no prying questions. He saw a woman living alone who wanted to feel safe, and he respected that. He installed tiny, discreet cameras, their lenses like watchful insect eyes, hidden in the eaves, the doorbell, and a birdhouse facing the drive. They fed a live feed to an app on my tablet, and crucially, to a secure cloud storage service Susan recommended. Now I had an objective, time-stamped record. A record of every concerned visit, every pressure-filled conversation, every gesture and expression. It was my insurance policy against the "she's confused" narrative I knew could be coming. The fifth rule is the masterstroke. You must allow your opponent to follow their own flawed plan all the way to the cliff's edge. Only when they are committed to the jump does your intervention carry its full, devastating weight. A month after the initial proposal, David and Lauren's patience wore thin. My polite, perpetual, "I'm still thinking" was no longer enough. They arrived on a Sunday afternoon, empty-handed. The brochures were gone. Their faces were set in masks of firm, parental resolve. "Mom, this is becoming ridiculous," David began, his facade of cheerful concern gone, replaced by blunt impatience. "You're not being practical. This house is a valuable asset. It needs to be in the hands of a growing young family, not. It needs to be in the hands of its owner." I finished for him, my voice quiet but my tone fundamentally altered. It was no longer the soft, fluttering tone of an agreeable old woman. It was flat, cool, and carried the undeniable weight of stone. Lauren stepped forward, her sympathy also evaporated. "It's for your own good, Eleanor. Can't you see that? You're being selfish. You're holding David back from his potential." The word selfish hung in the air, a toxic dart. I looked from her pinched face to my son's frustrated one. I felt a profound, almost galactic sadness, but it was distant, walled off behind the glass of my new clarity. "Selfish," I repeated, letting the word sit. I looked directly at David. "I paid for your final year of college when your father got sick, and the medical bills soared. I signed over the modest inheritance from my parents to help you make the down payment on your first condo. I took a second mortgage on this house, this burden of a house, to fund your failing business venture when no bank would touch it. And for the last 15 years since your father passed, I have lived on a tight, careful budget to maintain this property and my independence, while you have never once offered to contribute to a utility bill, a repair, or a property tax payment. Selfish is a word you should look up in a dictionary, David. You seem to have forgotten its meaning." The silence in the room was absolute and deafening. They were stunned, not so much by the facts, which they knew, but by hearing them recited in my calm, unbroken voice. They had never heard this voice before. It was the voice of the bookkeeper, the historian, the unflinching steward of my own life. I stood up, my movements deliberate and steady. I walked to the antique roll-top desk in the corner, a piece David had always said was dusty and outdated. I opened it, took out a single sheet of paper, and walked back. I placed it on the kitchen table between us. It was a letter, drafted by Susan and me, printed on crisp white paper. It was stark in its simplicity. It stated that I, Eleanor G. Harper, was the sole legal owner of the property at my address. That I was of sound mind and body. that I had no intention of vacating the premises now or in the foreseeable future, that any further attempts to coerce, harass, or intimidate me into doing so would be documented and met with immediate legal action, including but not limited to petitions for restraining orders and suits for intentional infliction of emotional distress. My signature was at the bottom, bold and unwavering. "This is not a discussion, David," I said, my gaze locking with his. "This is a notification. This is my home. You are my son, and you are welcome in it, but only if you can respect that basic, non-negotiable fact." His face flushed a deep, mottled red, a combination of rage and shame. "You can't do this," he sputtered, the last vestige of his adult rationality crumbling. "I'm trying to take care of you. You are trying to take care of my asset," I corrected him, my voice still chillingly calm. "And from this moment forward, I am taking care of myself." The sixth rule is to be prepared for the escalation, for when a quiet war turns hot. True to Susan's prediction, they did not retreat gracefully. Within a week, a uniformed process server was at my door, handing me a formal legal summons. David had filed a petition in court to have me declared a vulnerable adult, and to have himself appointed as the conservator of my person and estate. The paperwork was a masterpiece of twisted narrative. It claimed I was making irrational and hazardous financial decisions, citing my security system installation, was isolating myself from family. Their visits were clearly too stressful for my fragile state, was squandering resources on unnecessary home modifications, and was unable to manage the demands of daily living due to advanced age. The audacity was breathtaking, a violent inversion of reality, but the cold clarity held. This was his move, and Susan and I had been waiting for it. We had our countermove prepared. The day in court arrived. I wore a simple, elegant navy blue dress. Jack had always said blue brought out the light in my eyes. Susan wore a sharp black suit that commanded authority. We were a portrait of composed dignity. David and Lauren sat across the aisle with their own young, slick lawyer. They looked confident, even pitying. The judge, a woman in her 60s with weary eyes that had seen every family tragedy imaginable, called the case. "Your Honor," Susan began, her voice clear and resonant in the wood-paneled room. "This petition is not an act of filial concern. It is a transparent, premeditated attempt at elder financial abuse. Mrs. Harper is of sound mind, as will be abundantly clear." She presented our evidence, a meticulously organized binder. First, the deed, establishing my sole ownership. Second, my financial records, showing decades of impeccable budgeting, balanced checkbooks, and timely bill payments. Third, the glowing report from the independent geriatric psychologist Susan had retained, who had spent hours with me and concluded I had superior cognitive function and financial acuity for my age. Then Susan turned to the attack. She entered into evidence the promissory note for the unpaid loan. She submitted records showing David's struggling business finances, acquired through a subpoena. She presented his own text messages, where he had written to a friend, "Once we get the house sold, this liquidity crisis is over. Mom's place is sitting on a gold mine." And finally, the coup de grace. With the judge's permission, Susan played select, clear clips from my security cameras. There was David on my sofa, gesturing emphatically about "your future." There was Lauren pointing a finger saying, "You're being selfish." The audio was crisp, their faces unmistakable. It was not the portrait of concerned caregivers. It was the record of aggressive persuaders. The judge listened, her expression growing stonier by the minute. She barely looked at David's lawyer's rebuttal. When it was over, she removed her glasses and leveled a gaze at my son that could have frozen fire. "Mr. Harper," she said, her voice low and dangerous, "this court is not a tool for filial extortion. The evidence presented by your mother is not merely persuasive. It is damning of your motives. The petition for conservatorship is denied." Vehemently. She paused, letting the word hang. "Furthermore, based on the evidence of the unpaid loan and the demonstrable pattern of harassment captured on video, I am advising Mrs. Harper of her clear right to pursue a civil suit for financial restitution and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The court would look favorably upon such a claim." She then turned her gaze to me. "Mrs. Harper, given the circumstances, would you like to pursue that civil action?" Every eye in the courtroom turned to me. I looked at my son. The confidence was gone, replaced by a pale, sickly fear. He looked young again, small-caught. In that moment, I didn't see the adversary. I saw the little boy who had brought me a dandelion as a bouquet. The weight of the gavel was in my hands. I could crush him financially, expose him publicly, and the law would support me. That was the revenge so many would have craved. I took a slow breath, my eyes meeting the judge's. "No, Your Honor," I said, my voice firm but quiet in the silent room. "I do not want his money. I never did. I just wanted my son back. But I will accept, with gratitude, the protection of this court's ruling." The finality of the judge's gavel striking the sound block was the loudest sound I had ever heard. Crack. It was over. The legal revenge was complete, a total and unassailable victory. But as we walked out of the courthouse, Susan's hand a supportive anchor under my elbow, I felt no triumph. I felt only the desolate, windswept quiet of a battlefield after the armies have left. I had defended my home, but at the cost of my family. The personal war had left the field scorched and barren. David did not speak to me for a full year. That year was the true crucible, a time of profound and necessary grieving. I grieved for the son I had raised, for the man I thought he had become, for the future of Christmases and birthdays that were now dust. I allowed myself to feel the full weight of the loss, the betrayal, the loneliness. But I did not grieve in my fortress. I grieved actively. This leads me to the final and most important rule of quiet revenge. You must build a new, beautiful life from the very ashes of the old one you fought so hard to defend. Revenge is not truly won in the courtroom. It is won in the quiet moments of a life reclaimed. I took a portion of my careful savings, my money for my choices, and I finally renovated the kitchen. Not for resale value, but for me. I chose the warm cherry cabinets I'd always loved, a deep farmhouse sink, and countertops the color of sea foam. I hired a landscaper and transformed the overgrown backyard into a serene oasis of native plants and a small, bubbling fountain. I joined a book club at the public library, where I met Martha, a retired professor, and Clara, a former journalist. We debated novels fiercely and shared long lunches. I started volunteering one afternoon a week at the local botanical garden, teaching children about pollinators, my hands in the soil, feeling useful and alive. 3 years have flowed by since that day in court. Seasons have cycled in my garden. The silence with David eventually became a space he chose to re-enter. Tentatively, humbly, he began to call, not with agendas, but with simple questions about my health, comments on the weather. The other day, he came over alone unannounced. He stood on the porch I now own so completely, looking awkward, holding a bag of my favorite whole bean coffee. I saw the ghost of the boy in the lines of the man's anxious face. I let him in. We sat in the living room, sunlight dappling through the new curtains. "Mom," he said, his voice thick with an emotion I hadn't heard in years. "I am so sorry. I was wrong. I was arrogant, and I was greedy, and I failed you in every way a son can." The words were right. They were necessary. But forgiveness, I have learned, is not a switch you flip for offering an apology. It is a long, often lonely path you walk, rebuilding trust stone by stone. You must walk it alone for a very long time before you can walk it beside the person who broke the road. I am on that path. I do not know if David and I will ever reach its end together, or if the bridge can ever bear the full weight of what was. But I nodded that day. I took the bag of coffee. I said, "Would you like a cup?" And I made it in my kitchen in my home. The house was quiet, but it was a different quiet than before. It was no longer the tense quiet of siege or the hollow quiet of loneliness. It was the quiet of peace earned, of sovereignty asserted, of a hard-won tranquility that cannot be given or taken away by anyone. So, my dear friends, that is my story of quiet revenge. It was never about hurting him back. It was about the radical, revolutionary act of reclaiming myself. They thought they were putting a harmless old woman out to pasture. Instead, with their cruelty, they awakened a force of nature they never knew resided in their midst. My revenge is in this breath, in this peace, in this cup of coffee in my sunny kitchen. My revenge is this unassailable, deeply lived truth. I am here. I am home. My hair is silver. My hands are marked by time. But my spirit is unbroken. And I am finally, truly, and completely my own.